Okay, chapter 14, Children and Rights. We have now established each man's property right in his own person, and in the virgin land that he finds and transforms by his labor. And we have shown that from these two principles, we can deduce the entire structure of property rights in all types of goods. These include the goods which he acquires in exchange or as a result of a voluntary gift or bequest. There remains, however, the difficult case of children. The right of self-ownership by each man has been established for adults, for natural self-owners who must use their minds to select and pursue their ends. On the other hand, it is clear that a newborn babe is in no natural sense an existing self-owner. I don't think it's clear. But rather a potential self-owner. But this poses a difficult problem, for when or in what way does a growing child acquire his natural right to liberty and self-ownership? Gradually or all at once? At what age? And what criteria do we set forth for this shift or transition? It's unfortunate to me that he just hand-waved away. He didn't justify why a newborn is not a self-owner. Like, why not?
Perhaps maybe he'll get into it a little bit more later on.
First, let us begin with the prenatal child. What is the parent's, or rather the mother's, property right in the fetus? In the first... Oh, we're going abortion here. All right, here we go. In the first place...
Here we go.
Strap in. In the first place, we must note that the conservative Catholic position has generally been dismissed too brusquely. This position holds that the fetus is a living person, and hence that abortion is an act of murder, and must therefore be outlawed, as in the case of any murder. The usual reply is simply to demarcate birth as the beginning of a live human being possessing natural rights, including the right not to be murdered. Before birth, the counter-argument runs, the child cannot be considered a living person. But the Catholic reply that the fetus is alive and is an imminently potential person then becomes disquietingly close to the general view that a newborn baby cannot be aggressed against because it is a potential adult. While birth is indeed the proper line of demarcation, the usual formulation makes birth an arbitrary dividing line, and lacks sufficient rational groundwork in the theory of self-ownership. I am tempted to jump in now, but I kind of want to give him enough rope for me to hang him with here in a little bit. So
yeah, give him a little bit more. We got plenty of pages here. Yeah.
That's right. That's right. The proper groundwork for analysis of abortion is in every man's absolute right of self-ownership. This implies immediately that every woman has the absolute right to her own body, that she has absolute dominion over her body and everything within it. This includes the fetus. Most fetuses are in the mother's womb because the mother consents to this situation, but the fetus is there by the mother's freely granted consent. But should the mother decide that she does not want the fetus there any longer, then the fetus becomes a parasitic invader of her person, and the mother has the perfect right to expel this invader from her domain. Abortion should be looked upon not as murder of a living person, but as the expulsion of an unwanted invader from the mother's body. Any laws restricting or prohibiting abortion are therefore invasions of the rights of mothers. I mean, it's just completely wrong from end to end, but I'm going to continue a little bit farther.
Okay, just a little bit more, and then I'll let you go off, King.
It has been objected that since the mother originally consented to the conception, the mother has therefore contracted its status with the fetus and may not violate that contract by having an abortion. There are many problems with this doctrine, however. In the first place, as we shall see further below, a mere promise is not an enforceable contract. Contracts are only properly enforceable if their violation involves implicit theft, and clearly no such consideration can apply here. Secondly, there is obviously no contract here, since the fetus, fertilized ovum, ? It's like they constantly have to dehumanize in these arguments, right? Like we can't call it
fetus is too human.
Yeah. Even fetus was too human, right? It's got to be a fertilized ovum? Can hardly be considered a voluntary and consciously contracting entity. And thirdly, as we have seen above, a crucial point in libertarian theory is that the inalienability of the will, and therefore the impermissibility of enforcing voluntary slave contracts. Even if this had been a contract, then it could not be enforced because a mother's will is inalienable, and she cannot legitimately be enslaved into carrying and having a baby against her will. All right. Let's fucking tap the brakes, as Christian would say.
Yeah, let's pump the brakes here for a little bit. All right, where do you want to start? At the top?
Yeah. So, there is no non-arbitrary point beyond conception where you could say that a human gains rights. And again, to even talk about rights as something that can be gained is to talk about them improperly, in my opinion. Rights are mutually reciprocal agreements, and they should be afforded to anybody who does or potentially will reciprocate them. And it should exclude those who do not reciprocate them. So if I see somebody punch Christian, I have no onus or reason to respect that person's rights. He's obviously showing that he doesn't respect people's rights. It doesn't necessarily have to even be with me. It can just be like, if somebody attacks Christian, I'd be okay, well, that's an asshole. I'm not respecting his rights. I'm not reciprocating rights with that guy. And as to, there is no non-arbitrary, this cannot be said enough. There is no non-arbitrary line in the sand in which the clump of cells magically becomes enough of a human to need to start respecting rights or reciprocating rights with them. Another thing is, and jump in here if you have anything to say on any of this.
Well,
Otherwise,
I was going to say
gonna
what
keep
could
going.
be fun. What could be fun is if I try to steel man Rothbard here a little bit, and we have like a little back and forth with Rothbard's perspective. So how do you address this kind of situation when we have what appears to be at least a conflict of rights, right? The mother no longer is consenting to having this baby occupying their body and using their resources. How do we evaluate which right wins in this situation when we have the right of the baby or the fetus and we have the right of the mother?
I just want to say one more thing about this first paragraph where he says this poses a problem for when or in what way they acquire their rights, so to speak, gradually or all at once, at what age. The only consistent non-arbitrary answer is from the beginning, from the moment that they become a living, existing being. And also later on in here, he talks about like they're not alive when they're a fetus. That is scientifically inaccurate. Like they are like the scientific definition of life is met by the fertilized egg. That being will start multiplying and becoming, it's on its path. It is alive. It is replicating. It is consuming resources and growing and living at that point. So now to your question, there's a couple analogies. It is notoriously difficult to come up with analogies for birth because there's not any other situation in the world where life is created other than conception and pregnancy. So it's hard to find another example that is a direct analogy. There's a couple close ones. And both of them illustrate the important point here that goes to Christian's question, which is who is responsible and culpable for the situation? That's really that's really what it comes down to. If I, even accidentally, knock Christian into a lake, who owns, that's a bad word, who is culpable for that situation? Who is culpable for the outcome of that situation? If Christian drowns, who is culpable for his death? Even if I accidentally knocked him in, who's culpable? Me.
You.
Even if it was an accident. If it was on purpose, I think it's clear. Nobody quibbles with me on that. But the thing that's important is even if I accidentally break someone's window, I'm still culpable to get that window repaired or to make restitution for the damage that I caused, right? So that's the first thing. We are culpable.
To be clear on that, that's because intent is subjective. Like there's no way to pin down intent as like a motivator for any of these things. So it's inconsequential to the calculus whether or not you intended to break the window or push the person. What matters is the results in reality.
Yes. And then the second analogy that I summon to talk about this situation, because he talks about in here, withdrawing your consent. The mother consented to the baby being there, and now she doesn't. And the moment she doesn't, it goes from being a baby to a fucking invader parasite. Like, first of all, slow the hell down just a little bit, please. But no, the illustration I use to point out the absurdity of what happens there is that if I point a gun at Christian and I pull the trigger and I fire a bullet, and the moment that bullet leaves the barrel, I withdraw my consent to being culpable for the situation, then I just get to shoot people. Because I can just say, oh, I didn't consent to what that bullet did after it left the gun. Oh, did it hit Christian? Oh, crap. Oh, it killed him? Oh, man, I didn't consent to any of that. It's like, no, sorry. You pulled the trigger. You fired the bullet at him. And you don't get to just disconsent to the effects of your actions, in the middle, in situ, in the middle of the situation. That's absurd. That removes all culpability for all crimes. I mean, it's so apparent. So even if I accidentally shoot Christian or fire a bullet at Christian, I still don't get to withdraw my consent to that bullet flying at Christian, and the effects of those actions, I'm culpable for them, and rightly so. And if I'm not, we are erasing all crime, and we're giving it out to all property damage. I swung the bat, but oh man, I disconsented to that bat's momentum through the air right before it hit the person's window. Like, this is all absurd. You initiate a situation, even accidentally, you are culpable for the effects of that situation. So those are the two analogies I try and use to illustrate this. Do you have anything else you want to say, or should I continue reading? I'm sure there's more.
Yeah, let's do one more, and then I think we'll probably have all the ammunition we need to press on from here.
Okay.
So you brought up how the demarcation of where life begins is arbitrary, right? And that was like a big point for you. But in your construction of what are rights and who gets them, you include people who will eventually, or things that will eventually reciprocate rights. Is that not in itself an arbitrary demarcation of what are rights and who gets them?
It's trying to be inclusive, not arbitrarily exclusive. And it's for the purpose, and again, like, my conception of rights is trying to be descriptive, not prescriptive. I'm saying that here's how rights actually work. And one of the ways that rights actually work is when I'm asleep, you still reciprocate property rights with me, even though I'm not conscious or sentient or anything. If I'm in a medical coma, you can't come take all my stuff and it not be theft. If I'm unconscious on the operating table, like, you still reciprocate rights with me absent my conscious self. Why might be the answer, or what's the borders of that reciprocation continuing even though I'm no longer conscious or sentient or really there as a person mentally? It's because there's a strong expectation that I will return to that state in the future. I will become sentient and aware again in the future. I'll become reciprocating with you again, and it's a temporary situation that I will sort of grow out of over time. To not be arbitrary, we have to hold that constant, and we have to say that if we're going to reciprocate rights with people that aren't sentient when they're asleep or on the operating table or in a coma, a medically induced coma, or whatever, they got into a car wreck and they got hit in the head and they're in a coma, we still respect their rights. If we're going to be consistent, we can't use sort of consciousness, sentience, mental capacity as the demarcation on who we reciprocate rights with. Like, that baby in the womb is going to grow up in all likelihood to reciprocate rights with people. So there's no non-arbitrary distinction that we can make to allow us to kill that life that wouldn't allow us to also remove, not reciprocate the rights with a coma patient or, things like that. Does that answer your question?
Cool. Yeah, I think the one thing I might add to that is that I've seen a couple people say, like, okay, well, why don't you do it in reverse? Why don't you say people who have demonstrated the capacity for reciprocating rights instead of who will? And I think it comes back to how you were talking about of this being a descriptive understanding of rights, where the first time you meet someone, you have no information on whether or not they have reciprocated rights in the past, but you still treat them as if they will until proven otherwise. Bingo. So that, as a descriptive factor of rights, that, and not a prescriptive, that is why it's constructed in this sort of way. And I think I've done enough pretending to be Rothbard questions to where I think we have all the ammunition we need to handle the rest of this section.
Agreed. Just to restate in my own words what you just said, it's if we didn't reciprocate rights with people until they demonstrated their reciprocity, then rights would not exist and no one would reciprocate them because no one starts until they've already seen you do it. And it's a performative contradiction where if no one starts reciprocating until someone demonstrates it, then necessarily no one will ever start. And also, even if not everybody started or it wasn't the default, you have to prime the pump. You have to prime the engine. You have to say, okay, I'm gonna trust that you're not a shitty person until you demonstrate otherwise. Otherwise, I'm just gonna go around attacking and taking whatever I want, and we've erased morality. Like, if I'm not gonna reciprocate with people that haven't previously demonstrated it, then it nullifies morality.
Yep.
So hopefully I made that case cogently.
I think you did pretty good.
It has been objected that since the mother originally consented to the consent... Okay, I already handled that one. Yeah, the inalienability of the will. We talked about that. And he talks about it as a contract. Again, me knocking Christian... Just to rebut this point specifically about there not being a contract here, obviously no contract here. If I knock Christian into a lake, I don't need a contract to make me culpable for what happens if he drowns. That's not a contractual situation. That's more like a tort situation. I put Christian in a state of peril, in a situation in which he would die, and it's my job to ameliorate that situation to the best of my ability, because I'm responsible for it. If I have sex, even accidentally, and this excludes rape, by the way, which we'll get to, but if I have sex, I am culpable for that situation. It's my job to take care of that person that I put in a perilous state of dependence on me. If we're not culpable for our action, and that doesn't require a contract. That's where I was going with that. Okay, another argument of the anti-abortionists is that the fetus is a living human being, and therefore entitled to all of the rights of human beings. Very good. Let us concede for purposes of the discussion that fetuses are human beings, or more broadly, potential human beings. Well, they're definitely scientifically human beings. They're definitely scientifically living, and they're definitely scientifically human species members. So this is not even, anyway. And are therefore entitled to full human rights. But what humans, we may ask, have the right to be coercive parasites within the body of an unwilling human host? Clearly, no born humans have such a right. And therefore, a fortiori, the fetus can have no such right either. The analogy I use for this one is, if I abduct someone and I put them in my basement, can I then withdraw consent to feed them? It's like, I didn't consent. I mean, I withdraw my consent for them to be in my basement. They're just a parasite at this point. I don't have to feed them, and I'm not responsible if they starve to death. Like, come on. Like, what? You created the situation. This whole discussion is an attempt to get out of being culpable for situations that you create. And it's so obvious. The anti-abortionists generally couch the preceding argument in terms of the fetuses as well as the born human's right to life. I never used that, by the way. We have not used this concept in this volume because of its ambiguity and because any proper rights implied by its advocates are included in the concept of the right to self-ownership, the right to have one's person free from aggression. I also want to point out that I don't object to anti-abortionist as a term. I find both pro-life and pro-choice to be the misleading marketing propaganda of their respective positions. Abortion is the issue. One side is pro-abortion, the other side is anti-abortion. That's clear language, and I don't disagree with that usage. Just to digress. Even Professor Judith Thompson, who in her discussion of the abortion question attempts inconsistently to retain the concept of right to life along with the right to own one's own body, lucidly demonstrates the pitfalls and errors of the right to life doctrine. Quote, in some views, having a right to life includes having a right to be given at least the bare minimum one needs for continued life. But suppose that what in fact is the bare minimum a man needs for continued life is something he has no right at all to be given. If I am sick unto death, and the only thing that will save my life is the touch of Henry Fonda's cool hand on my fevered brow, then, all the same, I have no right to be given the touch of Henry Fonda's cool hand on my fevered brow. It would be frightfully nice of him to fly in from the West Coast to provide it, but I have no right at all against anybody that he should do this for me. Unless, says Patrick, Henry Fonda put your ass in that state of about to die. And then it's on him to fly his ass from wherever he is to touch your brow and save your life, which is the analogy to abortion. Moving on. In short, it is impermissible to interpret the term right to life to give one an enforceable claim to the action of someone else to sustain that life. In our terminology, such a claim would be an impermissible violation of the other person's right of self-ownership. Or, as Professor Thompson cogently puts it, quote, having a right to life does not guarantee having either a right to be given the use of or a right to be allowed continued use of another person's body, even if one needs it for life itself. Again, Patrick says asterisk, unless you put the fucking person in that state of life and death peril. Like, it's so obvious. Why are they missing it? Suppose now that the baby has been born, then what? And this is probably when it gets spicy. First, we may say that the parents, or rather the mother, who is the only certain and visible parent, as the creators of the baby become its owners. I disagree with that.
Yeah, children is property. Yeah.
Wow. Yep, here we go. A newborn baby cannot be an existent self-owner in any sense. So this the property that I respect, the property that you own, including your body, Christian, the only way you own it is in the context of our relationship and my respect for your ownership of those things. It's not some existential attribute that's tagged onto your body and all your property that says property of Christian. It is your property as in so much as the people around you respect it as such. And so there's no problem with a baby being a self-owner in the sense of the people around the baby afford the baby respect of its self-ownership in its body. There's no contradiction or problem there. Okay, I'm going to continue on. I get a little ranty here. If you want to read, can you read a little bit? Do you mind?
Yeah, sure. I will say also this idea of self-owner as like you said, like a property, like an attribute of you isn't how we think about any of the rest of property at all. It's actually an inconsistent application of property, right? It's like property is about exclusion to, and it is a consensual relationship that you have with somebody else who's willing to respect that. So yeah, just kind of wanted to reiterate that aspect. Put it in my own words, as they say, eat up more of our time. And I'm picking up at the therefore.
Hold on. Before you do, we just got a comment. This person says, you seem to think that the embryo was previously somewhere safe, and by having sex, you put it in peril. But that's not true. That's immaterial. If Christian is in a state of danger, and I take him and I put him in another state of danger, I was not culpable for the previous state of danger. I am culpable for this state of danger. The previous state is immaterial to the discussion. I created this situation, not that one. And not only that, but prior to it being a fertilized egg, it wasn't a living human. And so this whole thing is kind of a moot point. It's only at that point where it becomes a living human on the path to being able to reciprocate rights that any of this matters anyway.
Suppose now that the baby has been born, then what? First, we may say that the parents, or rather the mother, who is the only certain and visible parent, as the creators of the baby, become its owners. A newborn baby cannot be an existent self-owner in any sense. Therefore, either the mother or some other party or parties may be the baby's owner. But to assert that a third party can claim his ownership over the baby would give that person the right to seize the baby by force from its natural or homesteading owner, its mother. The mother then is the natural and rightful owner of the baby, and any attempt to seize the baby by force is an invasion of her property right. But surely the mother or parents may not receive the ownership of the child in absolute fee simple, because that would imply the bizarre state of affairs that a 50-year-old adult would be subject to the absolute and unquestioned jurisdiction of his 70-year-old parent.
See, when sorry to interrupt. When you hold that rights don't begin at conception, you're left with this problem of picking a point where suddenly they become self-owners, and you have to justify that arbitrary nonsense. And that's what hopefully he's about to try and do. We'll see.
Someone in the comments, I can't read the name, wrote, "Who wrote this crap you're reading?" It's a little libertarian. You might have heard of him. His name's Murray Rothbard. Just a small-time figure. I hear he's got a podcast or something. So, the parental property right must be limited in time. It's a temporal property. But it also must be limited in kind. For it surely would be grotesque for a libertarian who believes in the right of self-ownership to advocate the right of a parent to murder or torture his children or her children.
Do you see the hoops that you have to jump through?
Yeah.
Do you see the hoops you have to jump through when you don't acknowledge self-ownership from birth or from conception? Like, not only do you have to justify it in time, but you also have to justify why they own the kid but can't kill it. Like, if I own a dog, I can kill it. If I own a house, I can destroy it. But if I own a kid, I can't? So it's like limited ownership? Where does all this come from? It's nonsense. It's subjective. It's inconsistent. Sorry. I'm probably going to interrupt you more, Christian. I apologize in advance.
Actually, this is a super relevant comment. First one, not so relevant. Jim Jesus says Rothbard has an 8-hour-long lecture on natural law you have to watch before addressing it. That's good. But the other one...
Actually, the audiobook we're reading right now, Jim, is 14 hours long, so he beat Passio.
There's another comment directly below that I think you might be willing to address.
Haven't you said before that sentience is a requirement for rights? And I pointed out that when you mean it's actually known as moral agency, the embryo is not sentient or a moral agent, no rights. No, and maybe you missed it on the stream, but we talked about this like 10 minutes ago. When we said we reciprocate rights with things that are not presently able to conceptualize or reciprocate rights, only that they will in the future. Examples are when you're asleep, you still own your property, and I still reciprocate property rights with you because you will again in the future be able to reciprocate property rights. Otherwise, like, all I need to do is wait until you go to sleep, and I can take all your stuff, and it's not theft. Because we continue to reciprocate rights because you're going to become apperceptive of those things again in the future. Same thing, to be consistent, we have to hold that the same with unborn humans. They will become apperceptive of these capacities and will be able to reciprocate rights. So to be consistent, we should reciprocate rights with them from the beginning, self-ownership.
Okay, back to special snowflake child-owning property group. We must therefore state that, even from birth, the parental ownership is not absolute, but of a trustee or guardianship kind. In short, every baby, as soon as it is born and is therefore no longer contained within his mother's body, possesses the right of self-ownership by virtue of being a separate entity and a potential adult. It must therefore be illegal and a violation of the child's rights for a parent to aggress against his person by mutilating, torturing, murdering him, etc. On the other hand, the very concept of rights is a negative one, demarcating the areas of a person's action that no man may properly interfere with. No man can therefore have a right to compel someone to do a positive act, for in that case, the compulsion violates the right of the person or property of the individual being coerced. Thus, we may say that a man has a right to his property, i.e., a right not to have his property invaded, but we cannot say that anyone has a right to a living wage, for that would mean that someone would be coerced into providing him with such a wage.
Do y'all see where this is going?
Yeah.
Please continue. I'm withholding my rant.
And that would violate the property rights of the people being coerced. As a corollary, this means that in the free society, no man may be saddled with the legal obligation to do anything for another, since that would invade the former's rights. The only legal obligation one man has to another is to respect the other man's rights. Applying our theory to parents and children, this means that
Here
the
we
parent
go.
does not have the right to aggress against his children, but also that the parent should not have a legal obligation to feed, clothe, or educate his children, since such obligations would entail positive acts coerced upon the parent and depriving the parent of his rights. The parent, therefore, may not murder or mutilate his child, and the law properly outlaws a parent from doing so. But the parent should have the legal right not to feed the child, i.e., to allow it to die. The law, therefore, may not properly compel the parent to feed a child or to keep it alive. Again, whether or not the parent has a moral rather than a legally enforceable obligation to keep his child alive is a completely separate question. I don't think it is. This rule allows us to solve such vexing questions as, should a parent have the right to allow a deformed baby to die, e.g., by not feeding it? The answer is, of course, yes. Following a fortiori from the larger right to allow any baby, whether deformed or not, to die. That's all you have to do, is just let them all die. Though, as we shall see below, in a libertarian society, the existence of a free market baby will bring such neglect down to a minimum. The floor is yours.
This is the result of those arbitrary lines that we were talking about earlier. This is you necessarily lead to these kind of conclusions. When you miss the starting point of rights reciprocation, you lead to starving your children because you decided to withdraw consent to be a parent. I mean, the analogy is I knock Christian into a lake and I decide that I don't have any obligation to rescue him because I withdraw consent to the situation. And to say that I had an obligation to try and ameliorate the situation and save Christian's life would be to make me a slave to Christian. That's not how culpability works. Like, if there's very few core libertarian ethics, if not we own the effects of our actions. And while I hate that phrase, I prefer we are culpable for the effects of our actions. We're responsible for the things that we do. If we're not, property doesn't exist, right? That undermines everything. This is that I'm trying to show you like why this is absurd by describing it that way. We are culpable for the effects of our actions. And if you create a child and then not feed it, that is nothing other than murder. Oh my God.
I knew Rothbard was based, but holy crap, that's a super based.
That's not based. Yeah, that's
it's based in the original meaning of the term, saying just something so brave, yet so false. Our theory also enables us to examine the question of Dr. Kenneth Adlin of Boston City Hospital, who was convicted in 1975 of manslaughter for allowing a fetus to die at the wish, of course, of the mother after performing an abortion. If parents have the legal right to allow a baby to die, then a fortiori, they have the same right for extrauterine fetuses.
God
Similarly,
did he just call babies extrauterine fetuses?
He did. Similarly, in a future world where babies may be born in extrauterine devices, test tubes, again, the parents would have the legal right to pull the plug on the fetuses, or rather, to refuse to pay to continue the plug in place. Let us examine the implications.
I just want to say something about the extrauterine fetuses thing. This is the corollary to this kind of language, the dehumanizing language to help make your point or to ameliorate the emotional negativity of what you're espousing, is the same thing that they did back in slavery. Like, they're not real. They're not actually people. Those are not real humans that deserve rights. Those are just slaves. It's a different it's a different species. It's a different thing. We're not going to ascribe them the same rights as the rest of us. They're not like us. Well, they're just an extrauterine fetus. Like, that language makes it easier to talk about being able to murder something. So that kind of language is always a red flag for me in these discussions. Jim Jesus with the donation. Thank you, sir. I have to feed my kids. Statist. That's literally what he's saying. That's literally Rothbard's argument.
I didn't murder him. It was a post-birth abortion, as he is an extra-uterine fetus. There we go. Okay.
There are people literally making that argument in real time in modern times. It's crazy.
It's cool how we're able to kill two birds with one stone with this.
I didn't know we were going to do abortion today, but I thought we were just murdering natural law. I thought we were just aborting natural law.
Oh, we're doing the whole gambit, apparently. Notice, I want to say before we continue anymore, I wanted to do this one specifically because I knew we were going to disagree with Rothbard, and we skipped over like 10 that we completely agree with him on. So we are highlighting disagreement here, but it is a big highlight, an important one. So I felt like it was worth it.
Yeah, because again, like if we went through all the stuff that we agreed with Rothbard on, the stream would literally be 30 hours long. And we're going to focus on the disagreements. We agree everywhere else. Yeah. You want me to read, or you examine?
I can keep going for a bit. Okay. Let us examine the implications of the doctrine that parents should have a legally enforceable obligation to keep their children alive. The argument for this obligation contains two components: that the parents created the child by a freely chosen, purposive act, and that the child is temporarily helpless and not a self-owner. If we consider the first argument from helplessness, if we consider first the argument from helplessness, then the first, we may make the general point that it is a philosophical fallacy to maintain that A's needs properly impose a coercive obligation on B to satisfy these needs. For one thing, B's rights are then violated. Secondly, if a helpless child may be said to impose legal obligation on someone else, why specifically is it on its parents and not on other people? What do the parents have to do with it? The answer, of course, is that they are the creators of the child. But this brings us to the second argument, the argument from creation. Considering then the creation argument, this immediately rules out any obligation of a mother to keep a child alive who was the result of an act of rape, since this was not a freely undertaken act. It also rules out any such obligation by a step-parent, foster parent, or guardian who didn't participate at all in creating the child. Do you want to go ahead and elaborate on that before we go further?
Yeah, so the unfortunate situation is that rape is the exception to everything we've been talking about, right? So the parents of the child take positive action that, even if accidental, makes them culpable for this life in peril that they're responsible for. The obvious exception is if the situation was created by somebody else using coercion, which is rape. So if a man comes along and rapes a woman, well, she absolutely didn't consent, and even expressly disconsented to that situation, and therefore you can't hold her culpable for the outcome. The rapist is obviously the culpable one for whatever situation is created by his rape. And I mean, make no mistake, the distinction is clear. If that baby is aborted, it is still a murder, but the murder shouldn't be on the woman that disconsented to the entire situation. The culpability for the murder should definitely be on the rapist. So on this specific point, for different reasons, mind you, I agree with Rothbard. Now, as for like ruling out obligations by step parents, foster parents, guardians, etc., I mean, all those classifications of people are people that went out of their way to accept responsibility for the kid. So it's not like a foster parent could say, yeah, I'll take custody of this kid and then starve them to death. That would be a breach of the agreement, obviously. I mean, yeah, obviously. Well, I don't know. Yeah, it's so obvious.
I also really want to highlight this because it could be really easy for someone to misconstrue it. This is not an aesthetic like, oh, rape is kind of bad, so we got to make an exception there. This is a necessary implication of the exact same rules that we laid out earlier. It's a consistent application. So it's not like rape, that's kind of ooh, we don't like that, so maybe it should be, okay. No, this is literally from the exact same tenets that says you normally, under normal circumstances, could not perform an abortion morally. It's the same ones that necessitate it through reason that it is allowable in the context of a rape. So I wanted to make that super clear for anybody who might have missed that connection there.
A couple more comments from our dissenter in the comments. So first of all, your dissent is always appreciated. I like being challenged. I appreciate it. So this is not a contentious thing. I appreciate the discourse. This is good. This is healthy. This is awesome. This is how we improve and get better. He says, if the sleeping person has rights, does he also have responsibilities? Would you punish a sleepwalker who pulled a trigger and killed somebody? Yes.
Yes.
So, yeah, even if, let's say I have a dog that I own, and I'm not even around when it happens, but he escapes my property and goes off and bites somebody, or goes off and destroys someone's property, or digs up their garden. Well, that's my property. I'm responsible for it, even if I'm not even around. So yeah, certainly if I'm asleep, and like if I'm asleep and pull triggers in my sleep, then it's my responsibility for probably locking myself away from guns when I'm sleeping. Yeah, so that's the answer to that. Another one from the same person is, you don't just disagree with Rothbard, also with Narveson, also with Walter Block, also with Benjamin Tucker and Jason Brennan, pretty much with every libertarian theorist. The only libertarian I know besides you who's against the right to abortion is Ron Paul. Do you know another one? A lot of the libertarians I know agree with me. If you're looking for big names, I don't know. I debated this topic specifically using the specific arguments I'm using with you now with Walter Block on this channel a while back, and at the end of it, and while I agree with Walter Block, like in the case of rape, abortion is definitely still wrong. Eviction, where you remove the child with as least harm as possible, giving it the greatest chance at living, is definitely the correct moral action. So I agree with Block on rape. And by the end of the conversation, he said that what I'm saying right now makes sense, because I pointed out the culpability for one's actions in the situation. Now, a year later, a friend of mine sat down with him and talked to him, and he had totally forgotten about our conversation and kind of reverted to his previous position. But there's that. Yeah, so if I'm the only one, then I'm furthering the philosophy. Hopefully. Hopefully I'm refining things. And I think I'm making sound arguments for why. So it's not just like I'm stating my opinion and challenging you to say it to my face if you disagree. Like, I'm providing arguments. So
you're not the only one. I got your back, bro. I got you.
Yeah, there's two on screen right now. Strategic says, I don't believe Patrick identifies as a libertarian. I do. I consider a consistent libertarian synonymous with an anarcho-capitalist, which is synonymous with a voluntarist, which is synonymous with an anarchist. All four of these words, when held consistently, equal one another. I use all the labels, but I hold to them consistently. And I use the consistency term, just to digress briefly. I don't say you're not a libertarian, you are a libertarian, because there's a lot of bad libertarians. I say you're a less consistent libertarian, you're a more consistent libertarian. A maximally consistent libertarian is an anarcho-capitalist, is an anarchist, is a voluntarist. You want me to take over? Where are we?
Sure. Furthermore, if creation engenders obligation is where we stop.
Furthermore, if creation engenders an obligation to maintain the child, why should it stop when the child becomes an adult? As Evers states, the parents are still the creators of the child. Why aren't they obliged to support the child forever? It is true that the child is no longer helpless, but helplessness, as pointed out above, is not in and of itself a cause of binding obligation. If the condition of being the creator of another is the source of the obligation, and this condition persists, why doesn't the obligation? End quote. My answer to that would be, after I save Christian from drowning in the lake, I'm not responsible to provide him welfare for the remainder of his life. I have provided adequate amelioration of the perilous situation. And in fact, the faster I can get him out of the lake, the faster I'll be free of my positive obligation to save him. The faster I can make my children able to be self-reliant and be out on their own, then the faster it's okay for me to be free of my obligation to provide for them. And what of the case in some future decade when a scientist becomes able to create human life in the laboratory? The scientist is then the creator. Must he also have a legal obligation to keep the child alive? And suppose the child is deformed and ill, scarcely human. Does he still have a binding legal obligation to maintain the child? And if so, how much of his resources, his time, energy, money, capital, equipment should he be legally required to invest to keep the child alive? Where does his obligation stop, and by what criterion? Yes, the scientist should have an obligation to keep the child alive. And how much of my resources do I need to save Christian from drowning in the lake before it's too much and I can wash my hands of it and let him die and not be responsible for his death? I mean, obviously, any and all is the answer, is the consistent answer.
What is he looking for? Is it like that? That's a $5 death right there. Yeah. Like,
how much is Christian worth?
Yeah.
Let us. Hell, not to me, man. This question of resources is also directly relevant to the case of natural parents, as Evers points out. Quote, "Let us consider the case of poor parents who have a child who gets sick. The sickness is grave enough that the parents, in order to obtain the medical care to keep the baby alive, would have to starve themselves. Do the parents have an obligation to lessen the quality of their own lives even to the point of self-extinction to aid the child?" End quote. And if not, we might add, at what point does the parent's legal obligation properly cease, and by what criterion? If Evers goes on, quote, "One might want to argue that parents owe only the average minimal care, heat, shelter, nutrition necessary to keep a child alive. But if one is going to take the obligation position, it seems illogical, in view of the wide variety of human qualities and characteristics, to tie obligation to the Procrustean bed of the human average." End quote. A common argument holds that the voluntary act of the parents has created a contract by which the parents are obligated to maintain the child. But A, this would also entail the alleged contract with the fetus that would prohibit abortion, and B, this falls into all the difficulties with the contract theory as analyzed above. Finally, as Evers points out, suppose that we consider the case of a person who voluntarily rescues a child from a flaming wreck that kills the child's parents. In a very real sense, the rescuer has brought life to the child. This is a terrible argument. Does the rescuer then have a binding legal obligation to keep the child alive from then on? So if a bystander saved Christian from the lake, he's got to give him welfare for the rest of Christian's life? Is this a serious argument?
I imagine it has to be a serious argument.
In a very real sense, the rescuer has brought life to the child. No, it's not a serious sense bringing life to the child. The child was alive before the fire, and Christian was alive before the lake. I can use someone else if you don't like me using you in the lake. You're drowning.
No, you're fine. I am drowning quite a bit.
Does the rescuer then have a binding legal obligation to keep the child alive from then on? Wouldn't this be a monstrous involuntary servitude that is being foisted upon the rescuer? Yeah. And if for the rescuer, why not also for the natural parent? Because they created the fire. The natural parent created the fire, not the bystander. The mother then becomes at the birth of her child its trustee owner, legally obliged only not to aggress against the child's person, since the child possesses the potential for self-ownership. Apart from that, so long as the child lives at home, it must necessarily come under the jurisdiction of its parents, since it's living on property owned by those parents. Certainly, the parents have the right to set down rules for the use of their home and property for all persons, whether children or not living in that home. But when are we to say that this parental trustee jurisdiction over children shall come to an end? He's thinking about it as a jurisdiction over rather than an obligation to provide. And so, again, he's left stuck in the continuum subjective problem of when does it end? Because he's not thinking of it more in terms of a tort, but in terms of an ownership. He owns the kid's trustee ownership. Surely any particular age, 21, 18, or whatever, can only be completely arbitrary, correct?
It would be.
The clue to the solution of this thorny question lies in the parental property rights in their home. For the child has full rights of self-ownership when he demonstrates that he has them in nature. In short, when he leaves or runs away from home. Okay, so 5-year-olds can run away from home.
Yeah. I'm assuming he means leaves as in like permanently, right? Not like walks out the front door.
Yeah, which entails a lot of things that he's not mentioning. Like to be charitable, we have to say literally not walking out the door. We have to say the child decides to move out on his own and get a job in a place of his own to live, which entails a bunch of physiological and brain capacities to exist and reciprocate rights and to enter into contracts and things like that. So he should have said that instead of just leave the home. And that's me being charitable. Now, if a parent may own his child within the framework of non-aggression and runaway freedom, then he may also transfer that ownership to someone else. He may give the child out for adoption, or he may sell the rights to the child in a voluntary contract. In short, we must face the fact that the purely free society will have a flourishing free market in children. Superficially, this sounds monstrous and inhuman. I actually don't disagree that you should be able to offer to transfer the guardianship rights. Superficially, this sounds monstrous and inhuman, but closer thought will reveal the superior humanism of such a market. For we must realize that there is a market for children now, but that since the government prohibits sale of children at a price, the parents may now only give their children away to a licensed adoption agency free of charge. This means that we now indeed have a child market, but that the government enforces a maximum price control of 0 and restricts the market to a few privileged and therefore monopolistic agencies. The result has been a typical market where the price of the commodity is held by government far below the free market price, an enormous, quote, shortage of the good. The demand for babies and children is usually far greater than the supply, and hence we see daily tragedies of adults denied the joys of adopting children by prying and tyrannical adoption agencies. In fact, we find a large unsatisfied demand by adults and couples for children, along with a large number of surplus and unwanted babies neglected or maltreated by their parents. Allowing a free market in children would eliminate this imbalance and would allow for an allocation of babies and children away from parents who dislike or do not care for their children, and toward foster parents who deeply desire such children. Everyone involved, the natural parents, the children, and the foster parents purchasing the children, would be better off in this sort of society. Completely agree with that paragraph. In the libertarian society, then, the mother would have the absolute right to her own body, and therefore to perform an abortion, and would have the trustee ownership of her children, an ownership limited only by the illegality of aggressing against their persons and by their absolute right to run away or leave the home at any time. Parents would be able to sell their trustee rights in children to anyone who wished to buy them at any mutually agreed price. The present state of juvenile law in the United States, it might be pointed out, is in many ways nearly the reverse of our desired libertarian model. In the current situation, both the rights of the parent and children are systematically violated by the state. First, the rights of the parents. In present law, children may be seized from their parents by outside adults, almost always the state, for a variety of reasons. 2 reasons: physical abuse by the parent and voluntary abandonment are plausible, since in the former case the parent aggressed against the child, and in the latter the parent voluntarily abandoned custody, or maybe decided to stop feeding them, let's say. 2 points, however, should be mentioned. A, that until recent years, the parents were rendered immune by court decisions from ordinary tort liability in physically aggressing against their children. Fortunately, this is now being remedied. Yes, don't spank your kids. Agree. And B, despite the publicity being given to the battered child syndrome, it has been estimated that only 5% of child abuse cases involve physical aggression by the parents. On the other hand, the 2 other grounds for seizing children from their parents, both coming under the broad rubric of I'm reading fast because I don't think we're going to have much disagreement here. Both coming under the broad rubric of child neglect clearly violate parental rights. These are failure to provide children with the proper food, shelter, medical care, or education, which he would disagree with, astoundingly, and failure to provide children with a fit environment. It should be clear that both categories, and especially the latter, are vague enough to provide an excuse for the state to seize almost any children, since it is up to the state to define what is proper and fit. Equally vague are other corollary standards, allowing the state to seize children whose optimal development is not being promoted by the parents, or where the best interests of the child, again all defined by the state, are promoted thereby. A few recent cases will serve as examples of how broadly the seizure power has been exercised. In the 1950 case of In re Watson, the state found a mother to have neglected 3 children by virtue of the fact that she was, quote, incapable by reason of her emotional status, her mental condition, and her allegedly deeply religious feelings amounting to fanaticism, end quote. In its decision, that could apply to some of these woke people raising babies.
Oh, God.
Shots fired. In its decision, fraught with totalitarian implications, the court stressed the alleged obligation of parents to bring up children respecting and adjusting to, quote, the conventions and mores of the community in which they are to live, end quote. In 1954, in the case of Hunter v. Powers, the court again violated religious freedom, as well as parental rights, by seizing a child on the ground that the parent was too intensely devoted to a nonconformist religion and that the child should properly have been studying or playing rather than passing out religious literature. A year later, in the case of In re Black, a Utah court seized
I don't know. Oh, nope. It's Utah. Never mind.
Yeah, a Utah court seized 8 children from their parents because the parents had failed to teach the children that polygamy was immoral. Not only religion, but also personal morality has been dictated by the government. In 1962, 5 children were seized from their mother by a court on the ground that the mother, quote, frequently entertained male companions in the apartment. In other cases, courts have held parents have, quote, neglected the child and thereupon seized the child because parental quarreling or a child's sense of insecurity allegedly endangered the child's best interests. In a recent decision, Justice Woodside of the Pennsylvania Superior Court trenchantly warned of the massive coercive potential of the best interest criterion. Quote, a court should not take the custody of a child from their parents solely on the grounds that the state or its agencies can find a better home for them. If, quote, the better home test were the only test, public welfare officials could take children from half the parents in the state whose homes are considered to be the less desirable and place them in the homes of the other half of the population considered to have the most desirable homes. Extending this principle further, we would find that the family believed to have the best home would have the choice of any of our children. End quote. The rights of children, even more than those of parents, have been systematically invaded by the state. Compulsory school attendance laws, endemic in the United States since the turn of the century, force children either into public schools or into private schools officially approved by the state. Supposedly, quote, humanitarian child labor laws have systematically forcibly prevented children from entering the labor force, thereby privileging their adult competitors. Forcibly prevented from working and earning a living, and forced into schools which they often dislike or are not suited for, children often become truants, a charge used by the state to corral them into penal institutions in the name of reform schools, where children are in effect imprisoned for actions or non-actions that would never be considered crimes if committed by adults. Hear, hear. Well said. Mm-hmm. That was a good paragraph. It has indeed.
A lot of this stuff coming up is mostly oriented towards like the state overreaching, and all of it's good. So,
well, should we
start to go on to talk about because I remember reading through in this section they talk about juvenile laws and how there's like no mandatory sentencing on juveniles, and this can lead to indefinite sentencings and a lot of terrible things that the state does to kids because the magic spells let them get away with it. And all of that stuff, I think we agree is not only bad, but terrible. Anything you want to recap on there?
Yeah. So if you create a situation, you're culpable for the outcome or the effects of your actions creating that situation. You're culpable for the situation. You have a positive moral obligation to ameliorate the negative effects of situations you create, and that includes creating human life. Even accidentally, and rape is a valid exception because you didn't consent. You actively disconsented even to creating the situation. I hold that Walter Block in his evictionism is correct in cases of rape, and I hold that he's wrong in all other cases of abortion. Though I do agree with Block again that as science improves and artificial wombs become more and more of a thing, and as science improves and makes it possible for younger and younger in utero babies to survive, this debate will continue. The number of kids hopefully murdered through rape eviction will drastically decrease. which is a good thing, obviously.
Particularly if there's any kind of free market solution on the backbone of that, where, you know, someone could pay you for your child and then, you know, sell the custody of the child to another person. Yeah.
Yep.
So
for the exact same reasons, Rothbard is equally as wrong that you can freaking starve your children. For the same logic. And he's right about all the anti-state stuff. The state's terrible and blocks child markets, which would ameliorate a lot of suffering in children that need better homes that they can't get access to. And the states, and not only that, but I literally, and I'm 80% confident that if the state wasn't involved in adoption, that I would have at least one additional child that I do not currently, because we were for a time and still are to a certain extent interested in adopting. But to do so, we have to invite the state into our home to evaluate our house and to have an opinion repeatedly over years, you know, and that's too risky. We're not doing that. So there's so literally, in a literal sense, there is some child out there that is not in an amazing, peacefully principled parenting situation because of the state.